When we hear about times of war and learn about the histories of many of the conflicts that have taken place all over the world, we hear about the harrowing stories of lives lost alongside tales of heroism. What we don't often hear about are the strange tales, the alleged brushes with the paranormal or the macabre, which are unsurprisingly overshadowed by the all too real horrors of widespread conflict. Here are 5 very strange but allegedly true accounts from war-stricken regions around the world at various times in history. This first tale comes from a Vietnam veteran named Mike. Whilst his platoon was on a recon mission, the American soldiers came across a wooden hut, which they suspected was an outpost harbouring Viet Cong soldiers. Willing to take no chances, the platoon burned the hut to the ground, but before the hut was completely burned out, an old woman approached them, clearly upset that they had in fact destroyed her home. She cursed them, quite literally, saying that every one of them would die if they didn't rebuild her home. The American soldiers ignored her warnings and carried on with their mission. After 5 days, 5 of the men had died from sickness. Nothing unusual about that in a war zone, you might say, but the remaining men weren't taking any more chances, and on the 6th day, they returned to rebuild the woman's home. The fatality stopped from then on, and they were later told by people in a neighbouring village that she was a known witch and had in fact put a curse on the platoon. Two paratroopers by the name of Jackson and Painter of the 2nd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment claimed that they had heard a high-pitched shrill noise similar to laughter over the radio at an operating base in Afghanistan. The men contacted the other guard towers in the area to see if any of the other members of their company had heard the noise. It came back that no one else had heard it. The 2 men were manning a guard tower overlooking a nearby graveyard, a location that was rumoured to be haunted by the ghost of a young girl who could be seen walking alongside a goat during the night. Past soldiers had reported the sighting through their night vision goggles, only to be faced with an empty road once the goggles were removed. One story even mentioned that the spectre of the girl had been seen on a balcony of one of the towers. The following night, Jackson and Painter were atop a guard tower when they both felt a presence in the room, followed by the clear sound of footsteps on the trapdoor which lay behind them, a trapdoor which led to the tower's middle level. Both men were huddled next to the tower's radio when finally Jackson reluctantly went to investigate. As he wandered the tower's upper level, another tower in the area radioed in to say that they had detected a 3-foot-tall figure wandering around the tower's lower level, but on inspection, nothing was seen. Both men were keen for their guard to end, but soon a message came over the radio saying that their relief would be as much as 2 hours late. The men cursed their misfortune, but the night ended with no further incident. The ghost story was to become somewhat of a legend in the area, with more than just a couple of reported sightings of the girl. The 24-year-old Jackson said in hindsight that he didn't feel that he was in danger at the time, and thought the ghost was harmless. However, despite the fear that they felt that night, the 2 soldiers were given a further 2 weeks of duty in Guard Tower 6 at the operating base, but nothing further happened. It has been said that after this, both Painter and Jackson became skeptical about the true cause of the strange activity. This next story comes to us from the First World War. An entire company of British soldiers are said to have shared this experience whilst in Turkey. The odd account was even printed in the Liverpool Echo. The British soldier's commanding officer had lost an arm after being hit by a grenade blast whilst in combat. The colonel was quickly evacuated from the battlefield, but died on the way to the field hospital. However, both the senior officers and the non-commissioned officers, all unaware at the time that their leader had died, testified that he did return to the company for a short while after he was taken to the hospital. The Liverpool Echo's account reads as follows. The company were at their post when the company's sergeant major turned to the company's commander. "I beg your pardon, sir, but I see the colonel is coming around. I didn't know he was back again." The officer looked up, and there, standing with his cap just a little to one side as he always wore it, stood the colonel. His boots were caked with mud, and an old pair of binoculars was slung around his neck. The commander was surprised and started to walk towards him when he dropped his stick. He stooped to pick it up, and when he straightened up again, the colonel was gone. The officer dived through a trench and rushed towards the company's headquarters. "Did you see him?" he asked, breathless. The three men looked up at his question. "See who? Do you mean the colonel?" "Yes, we saw him standing still and looking down the trench just here. We saw him for a full minute, and suddenly he was not there. We can't make it out at all," they said. "We thought he was in Dardanelles. Besides, all the men saw him too, and I don't know whether you noticed it or not, but he had both his arms." It was 1943, and a young British soldier was posted in Switzerland. Now, Switzerland did their best to stay neutral during the war, but after Nazi Germany began showing aggression towards the nation, British soldiers were posted in the Alps region to join forces with the Swiss military and help protect the people of the villages there. The young soldier and his company were stationed near a secluded village of only 500 or so people. Eventually, communication with the Swiss army became difficult due to the location, and then eventually impossible following a snowfall of 7 feet, which covered the roads leading out of the village. The phone lines were soon out of service too, and the blizzard continued, cutting the British troops and the village folk off from the rest of the world. During these times of such isolation, the soldiers and people of the village often found solace and shelter in a nearby bar. The villagers did not speak English well, if at all. In fact, many of the locals spoke German as their first language. One evening at the bar, the young soldier remembers being approached by an aggressive Swiss gentleman and being asked in very broken English, "Where take you the children?" Unable to decrypt what the man was trying to communicate, the soldier stood in bemusement at the outburst. But then another British soldier, who spoke fluent German, stepped forward and began conversing with the man. They were soon to be joined by the other villagers at the bar in what was to become an apparently heated debate. After a few minutes of confusion, the German-speaking soldier turned to the rest of his company and said that some of the children had gone missing from the village and that the village people needed their help in finding them. The angry man was in fact the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing from the village, and suspected that the British soldiers were somehow responsible, regardless of the obvious probability that they had been lost in the perpetual blizzards that battered the area. However, the troop's captain spoke to the gentleman, and with the help of his German-speaking soldier, learned that a few weeks after the soldiers had arrived, the homes of the village people had been broken into and items had been stolen. Wood and clothes at first, but then more valuable items such as jewellery. Then ultimately, the children went missing. The captain agreed to help, and promised that he and his troops would patrol the streets in hope of finding the children, or the culprit responsible, or at least a clue to shed some light on whatever had happened. That night, a soldier, Private Reginald, disappeared from the army barracks. With the suspicions now falling away from the Brits, the mystery grew, and both the villagers and the soldiers lived in fear of whatever lurked out there in the dimly lit, snow-covered region of the Alps. As the days drew on, no clue was found, and another child went missing. Were they abducted, lost to the harsh conditions, or eaten by some wild animal? The missing children were no older than 8 or 9 years old, but Private Reginald was a grown man, and a soldier at that, so whatever had taken him must have been a formidable force. 3 whole weeks passed, and finally the snow began to thaw, the sun began to break through the bleak skies, and the village night patrols became slightly easier to bear. It was just past midnight when the young 19-year-old private spotted the figure of an unidentified man peering through the window of one of the village houses. He yelled for the man to stop and gave chase. The commotion attracted other soldiers and they joined the manhunt. Out of the village they chased, and ventured further and further into the still dense snow on its outskirts. The figure then disappeared, apparently into thin air. The soldiers approached the vanishing spot with caution, their weapons drawn. What they found was a cave, carved into a large drift of ice and snow. Taking no chances, and by now desperate to bring an end to the madness, they fired their weapons into the pitch-black opening. After a few moments, they proceeded into the snow cave and shone their torches to reveal its contents. Private Reginald lay in the blood-drenched snow, having been shot in the chest, but it was what lay around him that confirmed everyone's worst fears. The bodies of 7 partially eaten children were strewn on the ground, all now completely frozen stiff, as well as some of the villagers' belongings. It's not known why Private Reginald turned to cannibalism, or why he chose children as his preferred victims. Maybe it was because they were easy prey. What was clear, though, was that Private Reginald had gone insane. But was it due to living in the dark, cold, isolated conditions of the Swiss Alps for weeks on end, or was it the effects of the war itself? Maybe it was both. This next case comes from the Central Highlands of Vietnam, in the province of Kon Tum, where 6 members of the 101st Airborne Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol had set up a protective wagon wheel position. That's heads facing outwards, feet inwards in a circular formation. They were awkwardly clinging to the side of a steep sloping mountain, whilst trying to maintain their positions and look out for any Viet Cong who may be hiding away in the bushes which lay ahead of them. All was quiet apart from the sound of birdsong. One member of the team suddenly felt uneasy at the sound of rustling leaves. It was coming from the bushes which lay uphill ahead of them. Then the branches shifted in a violent motion, violent enough to suggest that what was lurking there was more than just a bird. Soon the attention of all 6 men was focused on the scene. They brought up their weapons and waited for the arrival of what they assumed would be the enemy. The soldiers' pulses raced as the large head and shoulders emerged from the foliage. It was a long, angry-looking human-like face, framed with thick red hair. As the beast stepped out of the shrubs, the company of soldiers could now clearly see the thick hair which ran down the creature's back and over most of its muscular body. It was said to be standing upright at about 5 foot tall with a heavy, broad torso. As it stopped and glared at the soldiers, one whispered to the other, asking what he thought it was. One man suggested that it was a rock ape, whilst another said that he had seen rock apes in the area and this creature shared barely any resemblance. Another said it may have been a orangutan, but seeing as there were none in Vietnam, that theory was as useless as the last. Soon the ape man lost interest in the soldiers and climbed back into the bush. The soldiers were to learn later that sightings of ape-like men were nothing new to the Central Highlands of Vietnam, and the indigenous people had believed in them for centuries, naming them Nguoi Rung. Even during the Vietnam War in 1974, efforts were being made to track the species to find out its true identity. A professor by the name of Vo Quai was sent to investigate and reportedly found a Nguoi Rung footprint, which he took a cast of. It was studied by Vietnam academics and was said to be much too large to belong to a human or ape. More prints were found in 1982, and reportedly sightings in the region were made as late as 1992.